Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be starting a new Bible study with me series, which I am so excited about. So this is a book that I actually just have really felt God drawing my heart toward for a while now. And then when I put out to you guys on Instagram and also here on YouTube asking which book you'd like to see me do next for a Bible study series, so many of you requested this book, and so I really just felt like it was supposed to happen and that now was the time. And so as you can see from the title, we're going to be doing a Bible study with me series going through the book of Esther, and today's video specifically we're going to be doing Esther chapter 1. So if you haven't done a Bible study with me series before, basically how it works is we study a book of the Bible and we go through it chapter by chapter, and every week we devote an entire video to the one chapter. And then for every series I do for the chapter 1 video, I also like to really go into the context of the book because, as I've said so many times, context is so important when it comes to studying the Bible. I actually just did an entire video sharing how I prep for these Bible study with me videos if you want to watch that and kind of get a more in-depth look. Any of the resources I mention here, whether it be a sermon, commentary, my journal, Bible, highlighters, anything, all of that is linked down below in this video description. And I always like to say that just because I get so many questions about the different things that I reference, and I'm not always able to catch each question, but it is always linked down below. And so if you have questions, check it out. You can even find links to these different resources and products, and so that is down below. But let's go ahead now and get into some of the context. And so the first thing to know about Esther is that this book is a historical narrative. As we look at biblical stories, they illustrate for us truths that are taught more explicitly in other places in the Bible or in different types of genres in the Bible. And so I love reading through stories in the Bible and just gleaning those nuggets, gleaning those principles that God is speaking through them. And there's definitely so many in Esther, and so lots to look forward to. Another really important thing to know about the book of Esther is that God is actually not mentioned one time through this entire book, which is honestly crazy if you think about it. But God's providence is highlighted in this book. And so the definition of the word providence is that God in his power sustains and guides human destiny. And so what we see in this book is that God works through the seemingly natural. So things that are seeming coincidences or just natural things that occur, God is working through those things and orchestrating those things behind the scenes to use those things and move in supernatural ways. And so a key phrase to remember as we go throughout this entire book is that God's name is not in the book of Esther, but his hand certainly is. And many people believe that the fact that God's name isn't in this book is actually an intentional technique employed by the author, which, by the way, the author of this book is unknown. But people believe this was intentional by the author to sort of invite the reader to look for those coincidences and the ironic reversals, as the Bible Project calls them, which we'll talk more about. But the author is inviting the reader to look for those things and to see in those things God's hand. And so a little bit more of the historical context. Esther is a story that is set 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And so while some Jews have returned to Jerusalem, like we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, and like we talked about in the Haggai Bible study series I did, how they returned to begin rebuilding the city and the temple. And so while many returned, many also did not. And so this story specifically took place chronologically in between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7, and it tells the story of a Jewish community who is living in Susa, which was the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire, which is a part of modern day Iran. And so again, these are some of the Jewish people who did not return back to Jerusalem, but remained where they were in the exile. I want to give sort of a summary statement on this book that I found from one of the sermons I listened to. It was by Skip Heitzig of Calvary Chapel. I hope I'm saying his name right, but he does really cool videos doing kind of like 30,000 foot overviews of the Bible, and so basically just like really big overviews of each book of the Bible that are really helpful. But his description, I actually found this in his YouTube description, but I really, really liked it. He says, it's almost like a fairy tale, talking about the book of Esther. You have a Jewish maiden who becomes the queen of Persia, very Cinderella-esque, and then a villain launches an attack to destroy the Jews, which were her people. And then in the end, this villain's plot is thwarted by a hero and a brave maiden who risks her life to save her people. And so that kind of just gives us a picture of what this story is going to be about. And the book, of course, is named after this brave maiden. It's named after Esther. And one interesting thing to know about Esther is that is actually not the name that she was born with, but rather Esther is the name that she changed her name to in order to hide her Jewish identity after becoming queen. But the name that Esther was born with was actually Hadassah, and that was her Jewish name or her Hebrew name. And the meaning of that name is actually the myrtle tree. And there's kind of a cool connection here, because if you look at the meaning of Esther, which was her Persian name, the meaning of that name is star, which if you look at the Spanish word for star, estrella, it kind of sounds like Esther. And so Esther, Persian name, means star. Hadassah, Hebrew name, means myrtle tree, but the myrtle tree actually puts out a flower called a starburst. And so there's kind of that cool connection there. And then one more cool little tidbit with Esther's name is that the 3-letter root word of Esther, in Hebrew it means hidden, and then the full name, again, Esther in Persian, means star, which is interesting to see how God takes her from this hidden place to star, to the new meaning of her name. And specifically that meaning refers to a morning star, which shines brightly after the other stars have ceased to shine and casts forward light on what's to come for the morning, right? But this is cool also because historically, this story occurs at a really key point in Israel's history, and God is going to be using Esther in this pivotal way, again, shining light forward on what is to come. A little bit more historical context, I want to go over a couple other main characters, since again, this is a narrative. And so aside from Esther, we have King Ahasuerus, and this is the Persian king who is ruling at the time. As we're going to see, he is somebody who gets really easily influenced by a lot of different things and people. And then we also have Haman, and Haman is an Agagite, which we're going to talk more about the significance of that, but he gets placed in second in command right behind the king. And then we also have Mordecai. And so some, based off of the Hebrew word here, believe that this means it was Esther's uncle. Some say that it was her cousin. And for the sake of this study, we're going to refer to Mordecai as Esther's cousin, because that is what my version says, and so just for continuity. But I did want to point that out because I know I've been confused before when I've heard different sermons or Bible studies on Esther. Some say it was her cousin, some say it was her uncle. Again, in this study, we're going to say cousin. And then an important thing to note about these characters is that we see a lot of moral ambiguity. And so in this story, we're going to see a lot of drunkenness, we're going to see a lot of sex, a lot of murder, and violation of Torah commandments, even in the fact of Esther marrying this king who was not one of God's people. And so we see a lot of moral ambiguity that even Esther and Mordecai, who are Jews, even they took part in these things. And so it's important to know that in a historical narrative in the Bible, it doesn't condone everything that Esther or Mordecai do or take part in, and it doesn't hold Esther and Mordecai up as these perfect moral examples, but rather they are examples of imperfect people who put their faith in a perfect God, who God still worked through them to accomplish his purposes. This leads us into our theme statement for the book of Esther that I got from the Bible Project, and it says that God's seeming absence does not mean he has abandoned his people. He uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people who are living in a messy world to accomplish his purposes and fulfill his promises. This book asks us to trust God even when we can't see him working, and to hold to the confident hope that no matter how bad things get, God is actively working to redeem his world. And so that is the theme statement for this book that we'll come back to. And then let's get into now just briefly the book structure. So this book has something that is called a chiastic structure. This is something that was really common in Hebrew writing, and it's a little bit confusing to try to explain. So I'm going to put this screenshot from the Bible Project video here up on the screen as I'm explaining it. But basically, chiastic structure means that things that are happening in the front half of the book are mirrored in the second half of the book. And so we see the book open here with the greatness of the king of Persia on display, and then the book ends with Mordecai's greatness. The kind of second thing that we see in the book is Haman elevated, and then the second to last thing we see in the book is Mordecai elevated. And then we also have kind of the mirroring points here of the front half of the book, Haman's decree to kill the Jews, and then on the other side, Mordecai's decree to save the Jews. And then over here we have Esther and Mordecai's plan to reverse the decree along with Esther's first banquet. And then same thing, their plan to reverse the decree in Esther's second banquet over here. And all of these points are mirroring themselves throughout the book. They're leading up to this pinnacle point that we find in the very middle of the book. And that is when the story pivots. And this is going to be a very climactic point in the story when everything kind of flips. Haman's evil plan is flipped on him, and we're going to talk about what happens there. But just keep this in mind as you're reading, that it holds this chiastic structure. Next thing to know about the structure is that this book is 10 chapters long, and so this is going to be the longest Bible Study With Me series that we have done yet. And as we're going throughout this book, we're going to be talking about the different biblical principles or truths that this story illustrates as we find them in each chapter as we go. But then I'm also going to give sort of a more comprehensive, in-depth overview of all of these principles we learned from the book of Esther, and I'm going to share those in the chapter 10 video so that we can kind of wrap everything up. Also, chapter 10 is much shorter than all the others, and so we'll kind of have that extra room to do that. And then one thing about this Bible study series that's going to be a little bit different than other ones is that typically I always do like a further study section where we write in our journal and take one of the verses to study more in depth. And we're not going to do that in every single chapter in this series. In some of them we will, but in some of them, like chapter 1, for example, it is really just very narrative based, and there aren't any verses that are like really going into dialogue or specific things to really unpack. It's really just telling a story. And so in today's video and in some of the chapters in this series, we're not going to do that further study. Some we will, but even when we don't, the entire purpose of that further study is to really just meditate on what it is you're learning, to ponder on it, to store it in your heart, to pray over it. And so I encourage you to still be doing that even if we're not physically writing things out in a journal or dissecting them further. So just know that. And then this chapter 1, has 2 subheadings. And so the first is the king's banquets, and it covers verses 1 through 9. And then the second is Queen Vashti's refusal, which covers verses 10 through 22. But because this is more of a narrative, unlike some of the other series where we kind of go through one subheading and then stop and unpack it and then keep reading, we're just going to read through the entire chapter so we get more of that comprehensive story without stopping the flow. And then we'll go back through and kind of walk through and unpack the entire chapter. And so that is what you can expect. And without further ado, let's finally dig into it. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it and turn with me to Esther chapter 1. Verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's demand delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Marius, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his household and speak according to the language of his people. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. So the first thing we see is that we're introduced to Ahasuerus, or King Ahasuerus, and I just wanted to make the note here that King Ahasuerus is also known as King Xerxes. So Xerxes is actually his Greek name, which he is better known by. And I just wanted to point that out because, again, I've heard the story of Esther, and sometimes I hear it as King Xerxes, sometimes as King Ahasuerus. And so I've been confused by that before and just wanted to point that out. A note from the Enduring Word commentary is that the existence of this king and the circumstances of this story is extremely well historically attested. So archaeologists have actually discovered the ruins of the very palace where the events of this story took place, which I think is just so cool to see history supporting the Bible, which we know that it does, but sometimes we get arguments from people saying that the Bible isn't historically accurate, and it is. And so it's cool to just point that out. And the first thing I noticed here is that this king ruled a massive, massive area. So it says in verse 1 that he reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. And so just to understand what that means today, this would mean that he covered modern day Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and also parts of Egypt, Sudan, Libya, and Arabia. And so this is a massive territory. This tells us that this guy was very, very powerful. And I also want to read a note from my study Bible. And so it says that the time, which was 483 BC, the third year of Xerxes' reign, and so the time and the presence of the army, which it tells us here, suggest that Xerxes may have been building support for his invasion of Greece. And so we know historically that the Battle of Thermopylae took place in 480. And so this could have been part of what was going on as he was gathering these people, that he was also trying to build his support for this coming invasion. And so just to get that context a little bit. And then as we keep reading, we see that this was this party that he's throwing, and it says it was for 180 days. And so this is essentially this giant 6-month-long party, because that's how long 180 days is, that was displaying his greatness, the greatness of King Ahasuerus. And then this 6-month party culminated in this 7-day feast. So it was this giant party, and it's incredibly lavish. Some of the descriptors we see in verses 6 and 7 are that there were white curtain rods, violet hangings, fastened with cords of linen and purple, which purple kind of denotes just wealth because that dye was harder to get. And then silver rods, marble pillars, couches of gold and silver. Can you imagine sitting on a couch made of gold or silver? That really doesn't sound very comfortable. But they were on mosaic pavements of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, precious stones, just all these precious materials, expensive materials. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, so they weren't even all alike, they were all different and unique. And there was royal wine. And so there's here really just this picture of extravagance, of extreme wealth and extravagance. Next note I want to read from my study Bible is on where it says that drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. I wasn't sure what that meant, but this note from my study Bible here says that King Ahasuerus set the custom that everyone had to drink when he drank. And as we can see later on in this passage, it says that he was merry with wine, so we know that he was drunk. There was free-flowing wine, and people also drank when he drank. And so there was probably just a lot of drunkenness happening here. It was a huge, huge party. And then not only was there this extravagance, this drunkenness, but it says that the king gave orders to the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. And so as a guest, whatever you wanted, the staff was going to make it happen. And so this just seems like a really crazy party. And then in verse 11, we see this request that he makes for his wife, Queen Vashti, to come before all the men that he's drinking with and to basically flaunt her beauty. And some Jewish tradition, as I was learning from some of the commentaries, some Jewish tradition says that this request actually came from an argument that he had gotten into with some of these men about which country has the most beautiful women. And so King Ahasuerus was looking to settle this argument by showing off his wife. And some commentators actually believe that he asked Queen Vashti to come in naked, which we could see in verse 11 when it says to come before the king with her royal crown. So some people believe it was just her royal crown and nothing else. But there's kind of some dispute on this. And so even if that wasn't the case, he was asking her to flaunt her beauty rather than remaining veiled, which would have been customary for that day. And so either way, he was asking her to do something that was culturally unacceptable. And so knowing that, we can understand that her refusal wasn't necessarily just defiance, but potentially wanting to keep her dignity. And a note from the Enduring Word commentary on this, I'm just going to read it. it says that Queen Vashti was not a follower of the true God, but she had enough wisdom and modesty to know that this was not something she should do. Though biblically, wives are told to submit to their husbands, this does not include when the husband is commanding her to sin. Here, there is a higher obligation to obey God before man. However, it is important for a Christian in such a situation to maintain a respectful attitude toward the one in authority, even in disobeying their command. We do not know what Vashti's attitude was in this situation. And so we don't know if she kind of respectfully declined or defiantly declined or whatever the case may be. Another note from the commentary says that some Jewish traditions also say that her refusal had nothing to do with modesty, that she was ready to appear before the men completely naked, except that God smote her just as she received this request with leprosy, which is a disease of the skin. And the commentary noted that this is kind of a fanciful tradition, like who knows if that actually happened. The bottom line is we don't really know the why. And on that, I'm going to read this note from my study Bible that says the author doesn't explain why Vashti refused, probably because the reasons weren't relevant. The bottom line is that the queen was expected to obey the king absolutely. In this culture, that was the expectation, and that did not happen. And that is going to lead to what we see happen next. And that is that the king is enraged. And reading through this, it really reinforces that. In verse 12, it says, "At this, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him." And so we kind of have these two descriptors saying the same thing, really just reinforcing the point that the king was not happy. He's probably very used to getting what he wants. He's been for 6 months now just indulging every desire. And now his wife, the queen, is saying no to him. And so he was not happy. And here we kind of see what I was referring to earlier, that we're starting to get this picture that King Ahasuerus is very easily given over to wine, as we talked about him being drunk, to anger, as we see in this situation, and as we're about to see, to the opinions of others. And so he then asks what is to be done according to the law to these 7 men, these 7 princes who were around him. And he is here, we see that he is really relying on others to know what the law is or to know what should be done in a particular situation, which isn't necessarily bad. A lot of times people in leadership kind of have that counsel of people who are advising them, but we do really see him heavily relying on or being swayed by other people, which we're going to continue to see. And so the advice he is given is by this guy, Memucan. And basically he says, here's what you need to do. You need to create a royal order, this is verse 19 now, that Vashti is never again to come before you, the king. And this position that she has of queen is to be given to another who is better than she. Which I just think that language is so key, because as a woman, how would that feel? Like, you're kicked out of being queen and we're going to give that position to somebody who's better than you. And the thing to note about these royal orders or decrees, I'm going to read this note from my study Bible. The thing to note is this: the absolute authority of the Persian king is expressed in laws which, once written, may not be repealed. This legal convention will give rise to a difficult situation later in the story. What if the king changes his mind? And so essentially when the king issues an order or a decree, that is set in stone, and even if he changes his mind, he cannot change that decree. And so keep that in mind for as we keep going through the story. And so the first part of the advice given to him is that Vashti can't come before you again, and we need to replace her with a new queen. The result that he is hoping for in giving this recommendation and in giving this order is that all women will honor their husbands, because he's saying, look, if we just let this fly, how Vashti disrespected you and not listening to you, then all women everywhere are going to think that they can not listen to their husbands or their officials, and there's just going to be chaos. And so essentially he's saying, let's make an example out of this so that women can see what happens when you don't obey. And then the final part of the decree given is that there's going to be a letter of decree sent out to every province in King Ahasuerus' territory. So that's 127 provinces, and to each province in its own tongue. And the decree is this: that every man must be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. And so this is the result of what happens. We now have this queen thrown out, and we're in need of a new queen. We're gonna have to keep reading to see what happens. As a reminder, we're not going to be doing the further study section this time because this was really just going through the narrative that's setting us up for the rest of the story. But once again, I encourage you to take some time just reflecting on any little tidbits you took away from this, any principles you gleaned. Pray through those things and process them. But that is all for Esther chapter 1. Comment down below letting me know anything new you learned or just things that stood out to you. And then also please be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it or found it helpful, or if you're looking forward to this study. And then maybe share it with a friend who you want to go through this study with. We're just starting out and we've got 9 more chapters to go. And then as always, please be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. That's a huge way that you can help to support what I'm doing here. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you back here next week for Esther chapter 2. Bye.